Welcome, everyone. It's a Wrap with Rap. I am your host, Ron Rappaport. This podcast features extraordinary people who do special things to enrich our lives and people who have overcome major challenges and adversities in their lives to come out on top, as well as people who can educate us on an assortment of topics. My guest today is Lisa Lilly. Lisa is an attorney, adjunct professor of law, and writer whose works have appeared in various publications such as Parade of Phantoms, Chick Flicks, Strong Coffee, and Hair Trigger. Lisa writes suspense novels, mysteries, and thrillers. The title story of her collection, The Tower, formerly known as Sears, and two other tales of urban horror, was recently made into a short film entitled Willis Tower. Lisa is also the author of the best-selling four-book Awakening Supernatural Thriller series, which has been downloaded 85,000 times. Lisa resides in Chicago and is a past officer of the Alliance Against Intoxicated Motorists, AAIM. She became involved with the organization after an intoxicated driver caused her parents' deaths in 2007. She is here to talk about her overcoming her grief of the accident taking her parents' lives, her work in the Alliance Against Intoxicated Motorists, and her helping people deal with a severe loss or grief. Welcome, Lisa, to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So what was going on in your life and your family's life before this event happened with your parents? I know there was a previous loss.
Yes, I have two older brothers, and my oldest brother had one daughter. And when she was very young, 5 or 6 years old, she was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and she lived another 5 years, but she was only 11 when she died. And that obviously was a huge loss for our family, especially my brother. And that happened about a little over 2 years before my parents' deaths. The good thing is that last holiday season in the winter, my whole family was in. My brothers live in other states, and they both came in like right before New Year's, and we all visited at my parents'. All my nieces and nephews were there, and it was a good gathering. We had a great time together. My brother Keith loves this pizza place you can only get in Chicago, and we went there.
I'm curious, what's the name of that pizza place?
Lou Malnati's.
Okay, I haven't been there.
I don't think they've expanded beyond Chicago yet, but they have a bunch of branches now. And he kind of, twisted everyone's arms. My mom didn't like to come in the city, but it turned out to, I think, really be something our whole family needed, was to be together and just have fun. We had mostly seen each other more on sad occasions, and we're thinking about that. So we had a really lovely holiday right before then we had this terrible thing happen, but at least we had that great holiday season.
That was good. How did you learn your parents had been hit by a motor vehicle?
Yeah, it was the strangest call. And everyone I know who's been through this, it's a call, it's a knock at the door. I was home, I was working on something I was writing, and I got this call from someone who asked me my name. And then he said, well, I'm calling from Loyola Hospital. I think we have your father here. And then he said, who is your father? So I gave my dad's name, and he said, I'll call you back. And I just thought, I just didn't know what to think. And he did call back and told me, well, your dad's here, and there was a accident, and he's having some tests, and I think he'd feel better if you were here. And I said, is my mom there? Because they were in their 80s. My dad was nearly 89. They mostly went places together. It would be rare for my mom to be out without my dad. And the man said, no, she's not here, but can you come? And I said, sure, of course. Tried to call my parents, didn't get an answer. And I called a friend. I don't own a car. You don't really have to have one downtown. But in this occasion I did. I called him and I said, can I borrow your car? And I think he got it more than I did. When you get this kind of call, sometimes your brain just can't really take it in. And he said, let me drive you to the emergency room. So when I got there, they took me into this small room, and there was a chaplain there, and pastor from my parents' church and one of my cousins. And still, I wasn't quite taking in how
Yeah.
bad it was. And then that's when I don't even remember who explained to me that, my parents, at first they just told me my dad had been crossing the street, had been hit by a car. They told me how extensive the injuries were. I signed the forms for surgeries. And I finally said, I can't reach my mother. I'm very worried. And that's when the chaplain said to me, I'm so sorry to tell you, your mother didn't make it. And it was, I don't even know how I took it in. It was just such a shock to hear that. And I'm kind of glad they gave me the information gradually rather than just all at once.
So Lisa, were they in a car when it happened, or were they pedestrians?
They were pedestrians. So they were going, and this is why the pastor was there. They were going to an evening church service. They did a lot of volunteer work through the church. They were crossing, there's a parking lot across from their church, and they were crossing, it's like right directly across from the entrance, and there isn't a crosswalk there, but almost everyone crossed there. And they had done that thing where you walk to the middle of the road, and because you see one lane is clear and you wait for the other lane to clear. And this person in this SUV came by and did not see them and just ran into them.
Well, you were the one who had to tell your father about your mother's death and call the rest of the family. What was that like?
Yeah, those were some of the hardest things I've ever done. They had not wanted to tell my dad because he was going into the surgery and he kept asking about my mom, and they didn't want to tell him without family there. So I went in, and he was pretty aware and alert. And I said, Dad, do you remember you were in that a car hit you? He said, yes. And he asked about my mom. And I said, I'm so sorry, she didn't make it. And his face just went so still. And the first thing he said was, I didn't get the license plate. And it just so hit me because my dad he wasn't a super expressive person, but he would try to do something to make things better and fix things. And the idea, his first thought was, well, what could I have done that I found out later, he had been hit, bounced off the hood and the roof and thrown off to the side of the road. And the idea that he's thinking, I should have got the license plate, and I told him at that point, I said, they've already arrested the person, don't worry about it. And I, told him I loved him and held his hand, and then went back out because they needed to take him into surgery. And then the next hardest thing was really to call my oldest brother. I just thought, he just lost his daughter 2 years ago, and I have to tell him this. And I don't even remember what I said, what he said. He was stunned. He said he would be on his way in. And then my other brother I called, and at some point he passed the phone to his wife, my sister-in-law, who I've known forever. It's since I was 11. And by the time I told her what happened, she said, Tim's already packing up the van. He's going to be on his way.
Yeah. Well, you were in shock,
Yeah, I had the weirdest thought that, because I have all these nieces and nephews, and the oldest one was 25 living in Chicago. And I so wanted to call her. We're very close. And I wanted to call her for comfort for me. And I thought, oh, that's so selfish. Like she's a little girl. She wasn't anymore, but I'm like, she's the little girl. I have to take care of her. I can't call her and tell her this. And it was this crazy, of course I had to tell her. Her mom called her and told her, but of course we had to tell her and my other nieces and nephews. But it was as if I didn't tell any of them, I don't know, it wouldn't be real. And so I feel like, people haven't been through it. Like there's just all kinds of crazy things that go through your head that don't make any sense later.
Sure. When did you find out that the driver was intoxicated at the time, and about his history?
The police chief this happened in Brookfield, where my parents lived and where I grew up. And the police chief came, and it was in that little emergency room, waiting room. And he came to see me. And I'm pretty sure he's the one who told me. And the first thing he said was just, this person was intoxicated. And we all have pictures in our heads of certain things. And for whatever reason, I pictured somebody who was like 21 or 22, a young person who, this happened at 7 p.m. on a Monday night. And I thought, oh, this is someone who went out to dinner maybe with their friends and had too many beers and didn't know yet. They didn't have the experience yet to know that they were too drunk to drive. And I thought, how awful for that person. What a terrible thing to live with. And then the police chief said, well, this is someone, he's from your town. He was about my age, about 45, 46, that he had a previous DUI. He had two. He had one about 8-10 years before, but the previous, most recent, had been 2 days before. He had been driving his own car, crashed it, I don't remember, into a pole, wrapped around a pole, totaled it. He walked away.
Wow.
And was already, charges were pending against him for that. And then he I found out later, borrowed his brother's car. All I knew that day is he had borrowed someone else's car and been out at a local restaurant very nearby and was driving home. And that I want to say he was almost double the legal limit. And that I feel like that's when I just started feeling so angry, because I thought, this isn't someone who just made a mistake, and not just, I mean, that's a big deal, but who made a mistake in judgment. It's someone who should have known, like, he knew what happened when you drink and drive by experience.
Yeah.
And he just did it again 2 days.
Yeah, complete irresponsibility. I mean,
yeah, total. And that was, I don't know if it's easier or harder in that situation that there is someone who caused it, but that was a really difficult thing to deal with, that, this person's choice to drink and drive again caused this.
What was it like dealing with your mother's death when your father was still undergoing surgeries and other treatments in the hospital?
Yeah, that was, I really almost didn't deal with her death. I feel like I didn't truly grieve until probably a month or two after my dad died, because everything was, that first night we were, my niece and her husband did come to the hospital. We stayed all night, waiting for news. And then the night before my mom's wake, they had to take my dad in for another surgery. They had wanted to wait because that's so much trauma to the body, but they had to do it. So I didn't sleep hardly at all. I was at the hospital all night before my mom's wake. And then I ended up being late to it because of traffic. And it was almost this surreal kind of experience. All these people were coming up and talking to me. And I had one lovely friend who she came with me and she just hooked her arm through mine and she just stayed at my side. And there were times she just took me away and said, you got to have some water. You got to have something to eat. Don't just sit down. And that's almost how it was about 6.5 weeks that my dad went through this. He, from the second surgery, there was a week when he didn't wake up yet. And it was almost like there wasn't any room to really grieve. I did give a talk, speak at my mom's funeral mass, and I almost didn't, because I thought I can't, and neither of my brothers felt like they could do it. And I woke up at 5 a.m. I couldn't sleep anyway. And I thought, I have to say something about my mother. And I did, but I could barely think about it. It was all about, will my dad get through this? What medical care does he need? What decisions should we make? And just trying to be there for him. And I think probably everyone in my family felt like that.
You have written and spoken about things people say that can make grieving harder. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and this is difficult to express, because I never want people to feel it's hard. It's hard to comfort someone. So it's like, I don't want to make it harder for people. And at the same time, maybe it would help to know, one thing people would say, and I'm I don't think I've said it to anyone, but maybe I have, that idea that, well, God never gives us more than we can bear. And that's it. Someone came up and said that to me at my mom's funeral. And I just happened, my older brother who had lost his daughter was in my sight line. And I did not say it, but I wanted to say, you are really saying that to me? I mean, do you want to go say that to my brother who lost his only child? And now our mother's dead, and our dad has just had a surgery, and there's a good chance he won't wake up. And, people do have things they can't bear. Like, all these thoughts went through my head at the time. That I thought of someone I knew in law school who had committed suicide. And I felt like, are you saying if people can't handle it, there's something wrong with them,
Yeah.
But at the same time, this was someone I had known many years ago who I knew had had many struggles in his life with alcohol, and he looked sober and he looked like better than I had seen him. And I thought, this is something he needs. I think he needs that, he believes that helps him. And I just I can't poke at that. So I just said, well, there's more than one opinion on that. And thank you for coming.
You were very, very diplomatic of you.
It really, the only reason I mention it is that sometimes when you're grieving, it can be really hard because other people sometimes need you to make them feel better, and that can be hard. Something that it can be better to say something a little bit more generic, almost like just, I'm sorry. The other thing that was hard for me was people would say, oh, God had a plan. And this was just God's plan for your parents. And I think that can be challenging no matter what, whether someone's religious or not. But in this situation, it felt like they were letting the person who did it off the hook. And I finally, only a few people said it, but I finally started saying, I know who was driving the car, and it wasn't God. It was a drunk driver. And I think people understood that. But it was, when you really take that statement apart, if you're grieving, it can sound like someone is saying to you, hey, feel better. There's an all-powerful being who purposely did this to you, to your family. And I would never, if someone had a loss and they said that to me, like, I feel my child died because it was God's plan, I would never contradict that. I would say, I'm glad that comforts you. But I also would not say it to someone who suffers a loss, because you don't know if that's how they feel. So those kind of things where you try to put a meaning on it can sometimes make it a little worse for people.
Well, I'm glad we touched on that subject, because I think there's a lot of people listening to this, and they'll understand what you're saying, and it may make a difference. What things do people say that does help?
Yeah, there were some really wonderful things. For me, it really comforted me when people would tell me a good memory of my parents, or my godmother talked to me. It was right at my mom's funeral, and my mom and I had some rocky times. We got along great when I was a kid, and even when I was a teenager. When I was an adult and felt more vocal about expressing myself and our differences, we had a lot of clashes. And she came up to me and said, I wish you had known your mother when she was your age. She said she did all these things women weren't supposed to do. And my mom and I had quite an age difference, a 40-year age gap. So the world was very different, when I was in my 20s than when she was. So my godmother was giving me context, and she said, oh, women weren't supposed to go on trips without chaperones, and your mom and her girlfriend went off to New York, and they went off to the West Coast. And she said, and your mom bought her own car, and women weren't supposed to do that. And I felt like she had given me this gift by saying, hey, if you and your mom were contemporaries, you would have got on great. You would have really liked each other. And that was such a nice thing for her to share, knowing that we had some difficulties. So that was comforting. And really, the one thing that helped tremendously was people who 2 months down the road, or 3 months or 4 months down the road, would call and say, how are you doing? I know it's been a few months, like, how are you feeling? Is there anything I can do? Because that's when sort of the rest of the world has moved on,
Yeah.
understandably, everyone can't be focused on your loss, but I know I felt, and many people I talked to felt, that's when you're feeling most alone and at a loss, and people aren't right there
Right.
anymore. And it really was nice when people would do that, or even just send a card a couple months down the road and say, I was thinking about your parents. I really miss them. Just to acknowledge that, yes, you're still feeling a loss later, or maybe that first Christmas, send a note and say, I know it's the first Christmas, or if you're whatever holiday you celebrate, Hanukkah, I know it's the first time, and I'm thinking of you. And that was just really kind and really nice.
You learn who your friends are.
Yeah,
You really
yeah.
do.
And I really appreciated
Yeah.
people who did that.
You have also written about how our culture doesn't allow much room for grieving. Was that true for you and your family?
There were a lot of ways I felt like it was, and that was one example, the fact that, first I should say people were amazing at the time, where I worked at a very busy law firm, and I had senior partners I barely knew called me and said, can I help? Can I take something off your plate? Can I go to court for you? But if you fast forward a couple months, most people we go on with our lives. We sort of expect people to get over things. And certainly in a work context, I started feeling, oh, I need to take on some more work to make up for the time that I missed. And I feel fortunate that I could scale back. I could leave work early every day to go see my dad in the hospital. But at some point I felt like I've got to make up for this. And I took on too much too fast. I took on a very difficult case, and it was really hard to transition back off of that. Like it was nobody's fault, but the way our companies and our cultures are built, they're not built for you to go through some grief later, to have a rough time.
Yeah.
I knew someone years ago. I worked at a company. It was like a factory and distribution company. She'd been there for 15 years, and her daughter had she had a stillbirth, and they would not let this woman take off for the funeral because it wasn't immediate family, meaning her grandchild who didn't, who died,
Yeah.
wasn't immediate. They wouldn't let her take off to be with her daughter because their grief policy allowed 2 days. And she said, but that's my daughter. She is my immediate family. And they said no. And she was so bitter about that. In so many places, that's the case, that it's a day or a few days, and there isn't any room for 6 months down the road, you realize you're in a really bad place. And likewise, our sort of cultural views of grief, there are good things about it. People recognize that there are stages, but there's also this idea that you go through these stages and you're done. And really, most people I got to know, and this helped me to realize I was not alone, that sometimes 5 years later, something happens and you just go through a really rough time. And I've had people say to me, yeah, but that was so long ago. Why would that still be a problem? Or like the month of January is still often very hard for me. That's when the crash
Oh,
happened.
absolutely. Sure.
And it's 14 years later, but I still will have times when that's really rough. And people really close to me understand that. But I feel like if I say it to someone who doesn't know me as well, they're a little, no one says anything terrible, but they're also almost puzzled by
Well,
that.
and a lot of those people have probably never been through that experience.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
quite possible. So you
Yeah.
think, oh, but you get over it.
Yeah.
And yes and no, you do. You don't stay in that place where everything feels dark and it's not the way it was in the beginning, but now and then it is. And I think that's really normal. It can help for people to understand that that's normal and
Yeah.
part of it.
Well, it's also nice if you can talk to somebody who's been in the same trench you have.
Yes, for sure. So you understand that it's not that there's something wrong with you.
Right. Now, the local newspapers and television stations cover the story of your parents' deaths. How was it for you talking to the reporters, and why did you do it?
It it was sometimes it kind of helped because depending on the reporter, the first person I talked to was a friend of a friend, so it was someone I trusted, and I did it mainly because, and I still believe this, that there are people who still don't really grasp how dangerous drinking and driving is, and because, like, we're human beings, we rationalize, and a lot of people, and I had heard it over the years from people. My niece told me she would hear people say it. They say things like, oh, I haven't had that many drinks, I'm only a couple miles from home, my car knows the way home by itself, and I'm not going on expressways, I won't be going fast. And part of why I felt like I needed to tell the story as much as I could was, this guy was, he was going 2 miles home. He wasn't speeding. He was driving away. He had driven, it turned out he had been at this restaurant many times. He had driven this way probably hundreds of times. It was all the things people tell themselves. And what happened? He turned a corner and he didn't see these two
Yeah,
people.
he wasn't paying attention.
Yeah, he didn't. And there were, when this happened, there was just happened to be an ambulance on the other side of the street who saw my parents and had stopped to let them cross. And there was a pedestrian who saw all of it happen, saw my parents in the street, came to tell me later, a year later at a benefit, that they were smiling and holding hands, which was such a nice thing. He came just to tell me that. But like, these people saw my parents.
Yeah.
This man who had been drinking so much did not.
Yeah.
And I felt like if just one person read that story and made a different choice one night, maybe that would make a difference. It also had a nice effect of a couple local papers did some really nice stories about the volunteer work my parents did. And a stranger, someone none of us knew, sent a note to the family saying, I read about your parents and I didn't know them, but I found their story so inspiring. And she described some volunteer work she started doing because of reading this. And so in that sense, it made me feel good too, that talking about the things they did in their life and what kind of people they were might also be inspiring to
Right,
people.
right. I advocate for the Male Breast Cancer Coalition, and my motto is, if I can just touch one person, I'm happy. And
Yeah,
I'm sure I'm touching more than one, but I'm happy with just one.
right. The idea, even if it's one person who,
Right.
does something, whether it's a prevention, becomes more aware, it
Right.
really can, I believe it really can make a difference.
Lisa, was there a low point during the grieving process, and did that prompt you to make any changes?
There was it was maybe 6 months after my dad died. And this was where I had gotten on I was on lots of cases, but this one particular one that was so difficult. And I was working from like 7:30 in the morning till I'd get home at 8:30 at night. And then I might get a call at 9 or 10 at night that some emergency, because the case was in another time zone. So, everything was thrown off. And I was walking to work one day after a particularly difficult time. In fact, I had really wanted to go, it sounds, other people wouldn't maybe understand, but I really wanted to go to the 4th of July parade because my dad was a World War II veteran. And almost every year I took the train out, watched with my parents when my niece Emma was alive. Sometimes her parents would come in. She'd love to see her grandpa in the parade. My other nieces and nephews would come. And afterwards, there was a picnic with all my dad's friends from AMVETS, and a lot of my cousins would come. And I so needed that. I needed to be with those people who knew my parents. I wanted to see my cousins. I was at work all the time. I was barely seeing my family who was here. And after a particularly rough week, I was walking to work and I saw this CTA bus coming, and I had been feeling so terrible for so long. I thought, if I stepped in front of that bus, it would all be over. I'd be done. I would not feel this way anymore. And then immediately I thought, I could never do that to my brothers. I could never do that to my nieces and nephews. That would be a horrible thing to do to them. And then it really scared me that that was all that was sort of standing between me and that. Like, I like to think I would never do something like that, but it was really scary. And I went to work, and I went to our equivalent of human resources and said, I am in bad shape. I need to take some time off. I need to get off this case. Like, it's just, I need help. I need to just take a break. And I have to say, the woman, she was terrific. She said, I understand. And if you have any trouble with anyone, let me know. And I literally just sent an email to everyone I worked with in the firm and said, I'm taking some time off. I had some scheduled time for my niece's wedding, and I just extended it. I took 3 weeks. I didn't have that coming to me, but in that sense, again, I was fortunate. I had been at this firm a long time. I had good relationships. I would be hard to replace. Not impossible. No one's impossible to replace. But, it wasn't a thing where they could just hire a new person tomorrow. So I took the time, and during that time, mostly what I did after the family time with the wedding, I just spent some time alone. I went somewhere I had been before on vacation that I felt good, a place where I usually went to writing retreats. And I just cried a lot. I cried a lot, looking at like beautiful sunsets, and just cried. And I thought about what I wanted in my life. And that was when I had for a long time thought about leaving this kind of intense work atmosphere and all the hours and all the pressure, and either starting my own firm, working for a nonprofit. And I thought, I need to make a change. Like, this is not livable sure. When you're going through all this grief, and I can't even get an hour to like spend with someone in my family, or I can't take the 4th of July off to be with family. And it took me about a year, but I spent that year like exploring options, deciding what to do. And I feel like that was a big turning point for me. I still felt pretty bad for a lot of that year, but I was prioritizing feeling better and trying to make some changes that in the long run I thought would help me be more emotionally healthy.
But you could see perhaps some light in the tunnel.
Yes. Where before, I know that's, it's a little bit of a cliche, but before it really felt dark. Everything. And when I look back, I'm like, I always had that freedom to make that change. But when I felt so bad, I couldn't see it.
Yeah. What was the catalyst for you getting involved in a nonprofit that focuses on preventing intoxicated driving and on helping victims?
I got a call. It was a gradual process, but it is one of the people that I met through it are one of the bright spots of that time. And sometime, maybe a day or two after the crash, I got a voicemail from this woman who just sounded so very kind, who expressed sympathy. The prosecutor had given my name and information to her. And she said, I'm from the Alliance Against Intoxicated Motorists, AIM, and when there's a court proceeding, I will be there. If you can come to court for the initial arraignment or whatever the first proceeding was, I'll be there. I can help explain things to you. If you can't come, I'll call you and tell you what's going on. And there was something in her voice, just so kind, so compassionate. And when I met her, her name was Twyla, and that's exactly how she was. And after that, almost every court status date, I would go to court and see what happened. And she would just sit with me. She would hold my hand. She would take me for coffee afterwards and just help me understand the process. Because even as a lawyer, I at that time had no criminal experience, and it was very different. And a lot of times I didn't understand what was happening. So she made sure I understood it. She introduced me to the prosecutor. And then she started telling me about some of the other things AIM did. And particularly what struck me was that for victims, some families, let's say you lose a child, a lot of people don't have life insurance on a child and they don't have the money to pay for a funeral. If AIM could, sometimes they might pay for a gravestone. Some people don't have money for that, or they don't have health insurance. They would try to help. Couldn't be huge amounts, but could help in small ways. Pay a month's rent if someone lost their job because they were depressed and they couldn't go to work. So I started hearing about this. I went to one of the benefits. I talked with other victims. And at first, I was just there because there was some comfort. But Twyla said, do you want to join my committee? And pretty soon I was on the annual benefit committee. And then I started speaking for AIM and got on their board for a while. And it really was, as you said, that connecting with other people who have been through this. And they were I was so struck by these people who had been through such tragedy and yet had such warm hearts, were helping others, were trying to reach out and make things better, first for me. And then I tried to do that for people who this happened to later. And it was really very healing.
Oh, I'm sure it was. Yeah. Can you explain to us what a victim impact panel is? And is it hard being on that panel?
Yeah, that was one of the things I did through AIM. The court system here in Cook County and some other counties helps fund this. If someone has a DUI, they haven't killed anybody, they haven't injured anyone, it's maybe their first DUI, almost always part of what they need to do to serve a sentence or to get probation or get their license is to go to a victim impact panel. So if you're on the panel, ours usually had 2 victims and 1 offender, someone who had served their sentence and was coming back to speak. And you're talking to maybe 40, 50 people who had a DUI, and they have, as part of their sentence, they have to sit there and listen to your story. And the idea is very much what you were saying. If you could just reach one of those people, and you hope that by sharing your stories, it will have an impact. Because many people walk in there, and some people told me this afterwards, boy, I came in feeling like, boy, did I have bad luck. My friends drink and drive. They don't get arrested. This is so unfair. And then they'd hear the story of my parents or someone whose child was killed coming home from prom or 5 years old. And they'd hear an offender talk about killing his own friend and living with that. And sometimes they come up and say, wow, I guess I am lucky that I got pulled over. And that was part of the message, like, you were lucky. Someone pulled you over before you did something like this. Right. And now you have a chance to change. And I did it for a number of years, every couple months. And at some point I needed to transition away, because when you do it, the idea is to tell the story and really get the emotion in there. And that means kind of diving into that and going back and talking about how difficult it was and really telling it as a story that draws people in. And that can be really hard emotionally. And most people do it for a time and then they take a break and maybe they go back or maybe they don't. I hope someday we'll be at a point where there aren't any more victims and we won't need these panels.
Right. Well, it's understandable. People could get burnt out doing it, so to speak.
Yeah, it can kind of get you stuck in that place, but I can see at some point I might do it again, like just because I feel like it sometimes does. I believe it really does make a difference.
Oh, yeah. Now, being an attorney, how did the accident change your perspective of the legal process, or didn't it?
It did in a way. I understood more how hard it is for clients who don't understand the process. Most of my work is as a civil attorney is for corporations. So I'm usually dealing with a lawyer inside the company. So they generally understand better, but I do have cases for people who are maybe they just are a single business owner And I met plenty of people in AIM who knew nothing about the court process. And it was so difficult for them because they would come in for that first court hearing and think there was going to be a trial and it was going to be all over. And instead, the proceedings against the man who killed my parents took a year. And it was that fast because he ended up plea bargaining and not having a trial. For people who there's a trial, it could take a year, it can take 5 years. And people are immersed in this the whole time. So it really brought home to me just how much disconnect there is between kind of what we see of the legal process on TV and what our expectations are if we're brought into it, and the reality, and how hard that is for people, because it was hard for me, and I had a little bit of understanding and having done other law, and I talked to victims who would just say, I don't understand this. I've gone, why does the defense get to keep, getting one more continuance and one more report? And, why do they get to have letters saying what great people they are? And it can be a really confusing process if you don't, even if you do understand it, but if you don't, it can make it harder. At the same time, I mean, I think it is an overall really good system. But there are places to improve. If I ever got to run everything, there are things I think I'd be very conscious of, to try to keep things moving along, to try to make sure victims really understand what's happening.
Lisa, what are some of the mistakes people make when going through the grieving process?
I don't know if there's mistakes, but there are things sometimes that you end up that can make things harder on yourself. And I think one is even to rush yourself. When I talked about, like, I took on this extra work because I felt like I had to catch up. And the reality is no one actually said that to me. I feel like it's sort of in the water, but really I was partly doing that to myself because I thought, I need to get back in the swing of things. The way to feel better is just to try to seem like everything's okay. And there is something to that. Like, going to work can be, one, we have to make a living, but also there can be something healing about kind of going through the motions of an ordinary seeming day. But I feel like a lot of us really push ourselves to try to go back to normal maybe too quickly, or to put on a happy face for other people. I was so angry, and I recognized that anger was I felt angry at everybody. So I knew that a lot of the people I felt angry with, it wasn't about them, it was about what had happened. But I was so afraid of that coming out, of expressing that I was like swallowing a lot of my feelings. And it was like swallowing poison for a year, because I was so afraid to even let a little of that anger out, like it would explode all over and it would be terrible. And I think I would have been better off if I could have found sort of a safe way, someone I felt comfortable with to say, I'm so angry, I don't know what to do with it. Maybe therapy or grief counseling. I had gone to therapy in the past and felt like it was very helpful, and I'd worked through a lot of things. And I thought, well, why would I go now? The therapist can't bring my parents back, can't change this. And in retrospect, that would have been a safe place to be able to say all these things that I was afraid to say, to express all these feelings. And rather than just kind of trying to, just
hold them in.
Them. Yeah. And one of my brothers, we talked a couple of years later. The other thing I think is hard when you're grieving is everyone grieves so differently, and it can leave you feeling isolated. And this is my one brother, Tim. He was always there. He was the one at 2 a.m. in the hospital cafeteria with me. So he was there, and that meant a lot. And at the same time, I would say, I feel like I'm falling apart. This is really hard. I'm really angry. And he'd say, I think I'm doing kind of okay. And he was telling the truth of how he felt, but I ended up feeling, oh God, what's wrong with me? And years later, he told me, he just wasn't dealing with it at all. He said he was so out of touch with how he felt. And he ended up going through a really delayed grieving process.
So he shut down. He shut down, and
Yeah,
and
he
and,
shut
and,
down.
and he didn't talk to other people, which
No,
is
because
probably
he felt fine.
yeah,
He said he
yeah,
felt fine.
yeah,
And it's not that he should have done something different, but I think being able to recognize that even the people you love and really care about can have a really different grieving process. So you might need to talk.
yeah.
Your brother, your spouse might not be able, you might not be able to relate to each other. And so going to that, maybe that grief group, or that a stranger might, who's been through it, might be someone that it's easier to share with. And I think, a lot of us are kind of afraid to do that, or we just think we should be able to handle it on our own.
Lisa, the driver who killed your parents was eventually sentenced to 12 years in prison. Did that bring a sense of closure or help with the grieving process at all?
At first, it didn't. So there was almost this, when the sentencing was done, it was almost a like, oh, I thought I would feel somewhat better at least. And at first I didn't. I mean, part of it was I had never, as angry as I felt, I'd never wanted vengeance. I felt sad. There's nothing good about someone going to
No,
prison
no.
for, and
There's no winners in this.
there's no winners. It was just one more tragedy.
Yeah.
His parents were, they went to my parents' church. They were roughly my parents' age. Like I thought, oh, how sad. Are they going to live until their son is out? But I did want him off the road, because I felt like his history showed that probably nothing else was going to keep him from doing this again. So there was a little bit of, okay, at least this person is off the road. And then maybe a month or two later, I did start to feel better. And I think some of it was I was no longer waiting to see what would happen with that. I wasn't going to the criminal court every month or two to see what was happening. And it was as if at least one stage of this was done. And I started to be able to not let go of all the pain, but more often think about the good things about my parents that I remembered, where the going to court was always pushing me back to the pain and the loss. And in court, you do a statement about your loss, which is important for the judge to hear, but that also requires really focusing on that. So I did mine, I heard my brother's, and knowing that that was done did help. And I feel like that is part of why I think our court process is a good one, because there is some way to try to address this, to try to protect the community from someone who can't stop doing this, and also to provide some sort of justice, some sort of recognition, maybe,
Yeah.
that, yes, this was a terrible thing. This shouldn't have happened.
Lisa, you wrote a book that's partly about anxiety titled Happiness, Anxiety, and Writing, which we actually featured as an ad on one of our podcasts in our Facebook page. But it also touches on dealing with grief and about changing the questions that you ask yourself when you're struggling. How did that help you deal with your parents' deaths?
This is something for me that has been very helpful throughout my life. And during that time, and I think for anyone, when something terrible has happened, it can be really easy and normal and typical to kind of get stuck in thought patterns that only make you feel worse. I used to lie awake and imagine what happened, even though I had not seen it. And I had trouble not doing that. And I would think about, why did this terrible thing happen? And the trouble with the question, like, why did this terrible thing happen, is it almost invites answers that will make you feel bad. Because a lot of the answers people come up with are, the world is a terrible place, people are awful, or I deserve it. I did something bad and this bad thing happened to me. So one of the things I did try to do is ask myself a different question. And one of the questions I kept asking myself, even though it sometimes was hard to think about it that way, was, is there anything this week or today that I can feel grateful for? Is there anyone who I feel grateful for? And when I made myself take, 5 or 10 minutes and just think about that, there were so many people I felt grateful for. And it helped me spend a little bit more time on that. There was a nurse practitioner at Loyola Hospital where my dad was, who was just so compassionate. She was so organized. She always kept us informed. She coordinated the care. And I really took some time to think about, one, how kind she was, how good she was at her job, and the fact that, she was a nurse in the critical care, intensive care. So, almost every patient she had, it was life or death. And yet she treated us as if we were the only people that she had to take care of. So I really tried to not just make a list and say, oh, this person was kind and this person said a nice thing, but to really take a little time and think, what are the things that person did and how did that help me? And I think to the extent, you can ask a question like that. Another good one in the midst of when you're really struggling is, how for just 5 minutes could I feel just a little better? You're not gonna, for me, it doesn't help to say, oh, turn your frown upside down, or I'm just gonna feel awesome tomorrow. But I could sometimes say, okay, maybe I could just make myself a cup of tea and just take some deep breaths,
Sure.
or maybe I need to drink more water tomorrow, really small things. But to ask yourself, is there just some small thing that I could do that might help just a little? And sometimes that's the only way to get through, is just a very small amount at a time. So a lot of the things in that book are designed to make these small changes that feel doable, rather than trying to fix everything in one big, gesture or huge mindset change.
That's a great tip. What are you most excited about going forward with your career and your life?
Wow. So I right now I am working on a new novel. I have a series I'm doing. So I'm excited about that. I'm doing the 5th in a mystery series. And I'm also excited. I've started working with other writers who have full-time careers at something else, who also maybe have published a book and they want some help with both, how do I market this, but how do I juggle all the time? Maybe they work a lot of hours, or they work and they take care of kids and they have this book. And I feel like there's a lot of material out there for people who are trying to publish and write full time. And it's overwhelming because there's so much. And I've really enjoyed being able to help people who, are trying to do this as something on the side. And a lot of it is practical tips, but a lot of it is kind of emotional and mental health things of, how do you do this side thing and still have a life, do it in a reasonable way. And in some ways, I feel like that connects to the book, the book on anxiety, the book, what are ways we can live happier lives, whatever it is you're doing, whatever you're dealing with, to remember to take care of yourself. So I'm excited about being able to do that and help people in that way.
Well, that does sound exciting. Lisa, how can people contact you and your nonprofit?
They can find out more about AIM. Their website is AAIM1, as in the number 1.org. So they can find information there. There's some really great resources there about, DUI issues, about grieving. And they can find me through my website. It's Lisa Lilly, that's LisaLilly.com. You can find both my fiction, nonfiction, a podcast I do, and some blog posts there. And that's the best place to find me.
Great. Thank you, Lisa, so much for being on the podcast and sharing your story with us. You have been through a lot in your life, and I wish you nothing but good health and good fortune going forward. Thank you for all you do to help others through your work with AIM. And thanks everyone for helping to make this podcast successful by listening and sharing it with your friends and family. Your comments and suggestions to improve the podcast are always welcome. Our website is www.itsarapwithrap.com. Our Facebook page is It's a Rap with Rap, and our email is itsarapwithrap@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe, and for now, it's a wrap.